I'm Anthony Luscre, Kilo 8 Zulu Tango, and Tim asked me to do this, and I said, you know, Tim, I'm not really an antenna expert. So I told him that I would do something, and I put together the 10 worst antennas, and most important, the subtitle is, and what you can do about it. This is my contact information. I have a website, k8zt.com. If you go there, all this information will be available. I will also put this slide up at the end, so you're welcome to shoot the QR code later if you want, or go to tiny.cc/worst-ant. So what are the worst antennas? Number one, no questions, no antenna. Doesn't work at all if you have no antenna. The second one is, you really thought about that and you purchased a great antenna here at Hamvention, but it's sitting in your garage. Or you did get around to assembling it, but you haven't connected it to anything yet. The fourth one is that antenna that is improperly assembled. It was so complicated that when you took a look at the instructions, you said, I think this goes here. And I just got done putting together an antenna project like this. They did not have any lengths in the instructions. So it just said insert the tubes and tighten. Gave me no idea of the lengths. I don't know how this particular antenna is going to work out. We'll see. It's going to require a lot of experimentation. The fifth worst antenna is an antenna that's improperly installed, or you spend a great deal of time getting the antenna up and you dig out that old box of RG59 from Radio Shack. You remember that one? It was really cheap. And it's been sitting in the sun or maybe in the rain. But anyway, when you do that and use poor feed line or you do an improper installation, things are not going to go well. You need to try again. Now, you might have an antenna that would work great if you would put some time into a counterpoise. But we don't want to do that. That's a lot of work. You're thinking about digging and measuring those counterpoise. Well, the good news is every single one you add is going to add to the benefit of the antenna. So don't think about the fact that you need to have 128, but you do need to have at least one to start with. So all radios begin with one single radial and continue from there. Now there is a way around that. Don't choose an antenna that requires a counterpoise if you're not willing to put a counterpoise in. And there are plenty of antennas that do that. Now, where we're getting to now is not really the worst antennas, but when you don't have the antenna you need for the job. So maybe you have a great 160 antenna with this nice loading coil here, but you really want to operate on 2 meters. Or maybe you have that mag mount and you really want to operate on 160. So sometimes it's just a matter of you have a good antenna, but you need another one. So I'm going to give you permission now to tell you whoever's in charge of antennas installation at your location. I know it's not you. You need to let's say, Anthony said I'm allowed to put another antenna up because this is just not going to work. Now, we start getting into some more technical things here, and I'm not a technical guy. All the people that talked earlier are much better at the technical aspect. But let me just tell you that you could have the wrong takeoff angle for an antenna. And I think when we were looking at the 43-foot antenna, that was really indicative of what happens. On some bands, the takeoff angle is great to certain locations, but on other bands, the takeoff angle means you're never going to get there. If the takeoff angle is too steep, you're going to go straight up, come back down again. That may be what you want. But if you want to go long distances, you're going to need a different takeoff angle. So takeoff angle can be very important. Now, one of the things I haven't said that really underlies this whole thing is sometimes the best antenna means that you have to have more than one antenna for different purposes. And that's where number 9 comes in. Especially if you're doing a field operation, one antenna is a point of failure. And if that antenna fails, that means you're not going to do your field operation. So my wife and I, Linda, travel every year for field day, and there's something I always bring with me. That is 2 antennas and 2 radios. Do I use both of them? Maybe, maybe not. But the thing is, we spend a lot of time preparing for the trip, And we might have traveled a long distance, and I really want to work field day, and if I have one antenna and it fails, I'm stuck. So I have a whole presentation called Portable Operations, and I'll give you that link a little bit later, but it comes down to the idea that 2 is 1 and 1 is none if it fails. Number 10, the antenna that's worked great for years is now not working well because maybe it's damaged, the coax has been abused, maybe you have squirrels that have chewed all the coax. The antenna is worn, the coax is worn, the hardware is worn. Maybe the support structure is worn, which is really dangerous. Maybe you never put any weatherproofing on it to begin with, and now you're seeing the results of a water-filled coax line, or maybe some traps that are filled with water. By the way, those holes point down on those traps. Every year at field day when I would go out with our local club, someone always thought those should point up to let the radio waves out. No, they should be pointing down to let the water out. And then someone else had the great idea, why don't we just cover all those holes? Don't do that because the water will get in there and then it won't be able to get back out again. So let's stop talking about those 10 bad antennas and let's talk about how we can do good things and make things better. So to get rid of that first problem we talked about, you need to get at least one antenna up and working. You can always upgrade it later. It doesn't have to be the perfect first antenna. When I teach general and technician classes with 3 other people, we always warn people, you're probably not going to just buy your final radio as your first radio. You're just buying your first radio as your first radio, and there'll be many more radios, many more antennas to come if you're really serious about this idea of amateur radio. So don't be afraid to start with something simple, get it up, get it working, and get on the air. I'll tell you what, there'll be a lot more incentive for you to improve if you're on the air already and starting to make contacts than if you're sitting there with no antenna and not making any contacts at all. The second one is when you do put that first antenna up, or the second antenna, or the third antenna, take time to properly assemble it according to the directions. If you have questions, find someone to help you. Tune the antenna if it requires tuning. But one of the things you need to remember is when you tune an antenna, it's only tuned for the spot that you've tuned it at. If you move it to a different location, raise the height, put it over different ground, etc., it may require retuning. Number 3, keep it simple, Sam. Simple wire antennas are really underrated as a great way to get started. And the fact that they're simple means there's less points of failure. Sometimes a single band antenna is the way to go. If you want really high performance on one band, don't sacrifice that performance by trying to get multiple bands out of the antenna. Put up multiple antennas. Avoid complex designs. Remember that set of instructions you couldn't follow? The more complex the antenna design, the more likely it is difficult to assemble, the more likely there's multiple points of failure. Avoid severe compromises. We all want an antenna that's small, that's easy to put up, requires no supports, was very inexpensive, and what happens is as we keep adding up these things we want, we're taking compromises. So sometimes we just have to bite the bullet and say, you know, I think I need a little bit bigger antenna. Speaking of simple, here's the simple way to build a dipole. I know these figures aren't exactly right, but you can tweak them, and guess what? You don't even really need to tweak them. I guarantee if you cut any dipole to this length and don't pay any attention to your SWR meter, just pay attention to the contacts you're making, you'll have no problems at all. The really good news, because we're reaching a sunspot peak, that means 10 meters and 12 meters and 15 meters are open. What's the good news about those bands? The antennas are smaller. The D-layer absorption is lower. Your chances for long distance communication greatly increase. Guess what? Antenna height is also dependent on frequency, so those higher band antennas don't require as high of supports that work efficiently. If you only have one support, don't worry, you can still make a dipole work. You then turn it into an inverted V. Avoid mystery black boxes. I remember the box from the 1980s that was very infamous, that was packed with random junk and then epoxied together. So when you would x-ray it, you wouldn't see the big resistor in there, you would see the other electronic items. Now, of course, you can buy a very simple product but pay a premium price for it. So if you go to the Wet Noodle Antenna Company, you can buy this long reach antenna wire that's guaranteed to reach between 2 points, only at $149.95. Or you can go for the Miracle Whip antenna. Now, I want to tell you something about the Miracle Whip antenna. I have something very similar at home. I've made many contacts on it. But it is the best antenna by no means. One thing, it receives very well on certain bands. But you notice the frequency specifications for this. It says this antenna works from 80 meters all the way up through 440. And by the way, it's this big, the box we're talking about. So yes, you can use any antenna to make contacts, but you can also make contacts tuning a shopping cart, your gutters, your balcony, light bulbs. Matter of fact, I have a link when you go through the electronic version of this, you'll be able to click on the link and read the very interesting story by David Day, because he doesn't only use light bulbs, he finds the best light bulbs to use for his antennas. Also, there's a very interesting article, YouTube by VA3OSO called Loading Up a Wet Noodle. Now, no actual noodles are injured in that video because they actually substitute saltwater soaked rope in place of the wet noodle because they were afraid of it getting eaten by animals in the area. But it's remarkable what they use. They start off with a baseball backstop as their first tuned antenna, and it worked wonderfully. Unfortunately, the antenna literature is filled with subjective and often useless statements, such as, I worked Slovenia on my first contact. He gave me a 5.9 with only 5 watts of power on my side. We all know how your typical S-meter readings work. It worked better than X, Y, and Z that I used last year. So we're always making these vague comparisons and hyperbole about the antennas that don't really mean a whole lot. So it's difficult as a new ham to figure out which antennas you should pursue. And again, I say go back to the keep it simple. And quite often those go to wire antennas. Now you may say, Anthony, I don't have enough room. Well, here's something they didn't tell you in your tech and general classes. You're allowed to zig and zag your antenna all you want. And maybe it'll hurt the performance by 1 or 2%, but we don't care if it does that, because what's the goal? Making contacts. If you want to save some horizontal space, an inverted V is much shorter than a dipole. It also only requires 1 support. Delta loops are wonderful antennas that you can build with just wire and 1 single support in the middle. I would suggest you go with a vertically polarized delta loop. That's the one that looks like the triangle with the point at the top. Feed it on one of the sides, a little bit above the corner of the angle. Notice that little circle on the picture there. That's approximately there to do it. I have 2 links that you'll be able to go through in the electronic version to read all about delta loops so you can do your own delta loop. And you might be asking, well, how big does this thing have to be? On 20 meters, you could easily do this with an 18-foot support in the middle and easily fit it on your property. If possible, get your antenna outside. I know some of you can't do that because you have restrictions. So an attic antenna can work. Now, you start running into some problems with attic antennas. One is if you have a metal roof, that really hampers things. Also, a lot of the new shingles and things have metallic content in it, so they're problematic. So maybe putting an antenna in the attic is not the way to go, but for some people, that's the only way to go. And I guarantee, again, any antenna is better than no antenna. Try and keep your antennas away from other metal objects. They will interfere with them. Try and get your antennas at or near the recommended height. And typically the rule of thumb is sort of 1/2 wavelength above ground level. So I put a little chart here on the side. On 6 meters, that's only 9.5 feet. But on 160, it's 260 feet. I don't have any 250-foot supports. So what does that mean? I'm probably not going to be able to put up a dipole for 160 that's going to be very effective. I might need to think about verticals and other types of antennas on 160, and maybe the dipole isn't going to be the best way to go. If a height recommendation is impractical, Anthony and I just can't put up a support that high. Remember, inverted V only requires 1 instead of 2 supports. Verticals with proper counterpoises or radials are another way to go. An inverted L, especially on the low bands, 80 and 160 are very popular. That's where an antenna goes up and then it goes over like an L. And again, you might say, well, I can't get exactly the right height and the right width, the right horizontal. Experiment. It will still work. Maybe not as well, maybe even better. You don't know. A delta loop is another way to go. The antenna that was shown a little bit earlier, a dipole turned on its side is a vertical. It doesn't require a radial field because it has its own counterpoise with the other portion of the dipole. So there's nothing that says you can't put your dipole up vertically. Try and feed off at a 90-degree angle as much as you can, but don't sweat it. It will work. Now, I talked about portable operations. I have a whole site. You can jot that down if you want, but I'll give you the link again later. Tiny.cc port ops. It's a whole presentation on portable operations. I originally put this together, started it for Field Day in 2020. Remember what happened in Field Day 2020? Instead of going with your local club to operate, everyone was turned out on their own. And a lot of people said, hey, when I go operate Field Day, someone puts the antenna up for me. I just come and sit down in front of the radio and operate. So now they had to figure out how to do an antenna. So this portable operations has started off with a document on antennas and then went from there. This is that document. It's called Antenna Choices, Pros and Cons. I'll show you that document in a few moments. But I just go through different types of antennas. Then after that, I have resources for each of the different types. Sometimes it's not the antenna's fault. We blame the antenna when it's sometimes operator error, equipment error, etc. So I put together 3 presentations. And again, if your local club would like a presentation, I'm working on Present All States and All Countries. I've got about 350 presentations under my belt since the beginning of the pandemic, and I'd be happy to do a presentation for your local club. If you're close enough, or if you want to fly me in, I would do it in person, but otherwise I would be happy to do it via Zoom or whatever other electronic method you'd like. But I have 3 that I can really suggest to you. One is called How to Make That QSO, Get in the Rhythm, Know the Rhyme, and Dance the Dance. If you don't have that operating timing down, the best antenna in the world is not necessarily going to help you. Another one on successful operating. The one on successful operating is how to evaluate your station to see whether it's working or not. Ways you can check your station from a distance without even having other people to help you. If you're just getting started in VHF or UHF, I'm part of a group that put together a number of presentations on this. We have a 3-week show. It's 3 1-hours. And a slideshow to go along with it, Beginner's Guide to HF. We talk about antennas and other things involved with getting on the air with HF. And again, this is the link to the whole presentation today, tiny.cc/worst antenna. You can shoot the QR code if you'd like. And unlike everyone else today, I am unencumbered by time, so I'd be happy to take questions and comments and suggestions. Tim has let me loose for the rest of the day. He said until they throw me out of the room, I have the room for the rest of the day. So I'd be happy to take any questions you might have, comments, etc. So thank you. Yes, sir. Yes, I use them all the time. I have a 20-some foot collapsible fiberglass fishing rod. I hook up my thin wire to it, not the 3-inch stuff that was suggested earlier, because I can't do that. I run my KX2 to a splitter right at the BNC. I run 35-foot piece of wire and a 17-foot piece of wire that I throw on the ground as an end fed, use my tuner, and it works great. If you really want to get into end fed antennas, though, you need to think about the isolation between the radio and the antenna, and also the impedance matching. Quite often, end fed antennas use 49-to-1 balance, but that's not always the optimum. It depends what the length is going to be. It depends how you handle it. There's a whole lot of information out there. And there's also two fields of thought on end feds. One is to cut the end fed to a specific resonant frequency. It makes it a single band antenna. They work very well. PAR sells a bunch of them. Or the other way of going about it is to make it a non-resonant on any amateur radio band length and then use an antenna tuner to match it. And there's certain lengths of wire which are much more cooperative in their non-resonance from causing problems trying to get them to resonate on certain frequencies. And you can actually go on the internet and look up best lengths of non-resonant end-fed wire for antennas. Does that answer your question? Yes. And the great thing about end-fed, by the way, if you're not familiar with it, is it only requires one support on the end. Sometimes I also take my end-fed and put it up like an inverted V type of shape. That also works with end-feds. Sometimes I zig it and zag it. I go up one tree, then this way a little bit, then that way a little bit, because I never know what I'm going to encounter as far as supports when I'm going out in the field. Other questions? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I can't hear you because of the... It depends. I use 17 feet as you want to pick another non-resonant length, but you can play around with it. Another thing that when you're out in the field, you do know that if you have a wire that's a certain length, you don't need to cut it to adjust it. If you simply wrap it very tightly at the end, you can shorten or lengthen it. So what I do is I keep a pen in my backpack, and I actually wrap the extra wire around that pen and clip it together. So if it's not resonating, I'll make it a little bit shorter and try it out again. Other questions? Comments? You can't give any complaints because Tim is gone now. Any suggestions for the group? I know that many of you are much better at this than I am, so please, if you'd like to share something with the group, I'd be happy to let you do that. Yes, sir. Let me talk a little bit about the G5RV, because when I said I was doing this presentation on the 10 worst antennas, the first question most people ask me is, are you going to include the G5RV in that list of 10 worst antennas? The G5RV is a very misunderstood antenna. First of all, what we all consider the G5RV is not really the G5RV. If you go back and look at the literature, it's a really different antenna, and many other antennas. One of the things I would suggest is, instead of a G5RV, I would go with the dipole antenna fed with open feeder. I think you'll have a much better multi-band antenna if you go that route. Now, that may not be practical because open feed line is sometimes difficult to deal with, so you might have to terminate it in a balun and then run coax the rest of the way. If you can run it all the way back to the shack without any problems with open feeder, you'll have a great multi-band antenna with very little SWR problems on the feed line. But you do have the inherent problems of, well, you can't really put that open feeder up against the metal downspout and get interference with it, but take a look at that if that's a possibility. It's really a double, I'm not even going to tell you what name the antenna is. We're just going to call it a pair of wires fed by an open feed line. That's one route to go. And there's in the commercial G5RVs, there's a lot of different types of tricks that people use to get it to give you good SWR. And sometimes that means that just a good SWR doesn't mean it's going to resonate and radiate very well. Okay? So before I would buy a commercial G5RV, I would think about putting together some wires and feeding them and playing around with them myself. Well, then, never look a gift antenna in the mouth. Yep. Hey, if you can rotate it, that's wonderful. So give it a try. I'm sure that it will work out. By the way, one of the things that we also get hung up on a lot of times is the hardware for antennas. If you're putting up temporary antennas especially, or experimental antennas, go to your local Dollar Tree and buy $1 or $1.25 now cutting boards. Cutting boards are wonderful antenna insulation material, and they make great supporting resources for the point where your wires join your feed line. So those simple white cutting boards are very easy to work with. You can drill holes in them, you can cut them up, and they work very well as temporary insulators. Some of them deteriorate in the sun faster than others, but if you're worried about that, paint it. But again, this is for experimentation purposes. If you're putting it up at 250 foot and you're not going to have to bring a crane in to put it up, please use something a little bit more, a little bit more tested and strong. Other questions, comments? Yes, sir. What did you steal out of his yard? Did he put up the fence to keep you out? Well, the general rule with antennas, and this is sort of again one of those rule of thumbs, if you put up the opposite polarization or the opposite 90-degree angle, those both tend to help. So if you're putting a horizontal one up, I would put it at a 90-degree angle to his fence and see if that helps a little bit, because you're not going to get as much off the ends of the horizontal antenna. A vertical might work well. Again, I don't know what the solution to that is. I'm lucky I don't have an electrical fence near me. I just know things like that can be very problematic because it's not designed to be in a radio environment. Yes. Maybe he'll get the animals trained so he can turn it off like they turn off. You know, most of those invisible dog radio things cause problems too, but the good news is everyone turns them off or they get broken long before there's any problem with them. Other questions? Anything at all? This is your chance. Any questions about amateur radio? I'm happy to try and answer. Yes, sir. Yes, it will, depending on what type. It won't work in all cases, but a lot of antennas are designed so you do not need an insulator between the center pieces. If you look at most of your VHF and UHF, because the way they're set up, a lot of the different types of feeds, like a delta feed and some of the other feeds, allow you to have an antenna without a center insulator in it. Now, that's because that antenna is designed that way, so you can't just take any antenna and assume you can do that with it. On most of our HF dipoles, you will need a center insulator. But there are cases where there really is not a center insulator on an antenna. It's very confusing. You're thinking, well, this doesn't make any sense. But on your HF dipole, you want a good insulator in between it.